So you want to get high in the Middle Ages. The smell finds you before you find the shop. It rolls down the lane, dried herbs and ground resin, and something sweet you cannot name, and by the time you reach the open shutter, you are breathing through your mouth, because your nose gave up 3 steps ago. The man behind the counter has ceramic jars on every shelf, stoppered with wax, labeled in Latin only he can read. He can sell you something for pain, something for sleep, something for the kind of sadness that does not lift on its own. Not a single item requires a prescription, a consultation, or a moment of moral hesitation from anyone involved. The history of getting high is not a back alley story. It is a front door story, and the door has been open since before the pyramids. Before we settle in, like and subscribe if you enjoy these. And drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight. I always love seeing where these stories end up. Now, dim the lights. Switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Get yourself comfortable and let your shoulders finally drop away from your ears. Tonight is a long one, so just settle in. Let the screen do its thing, and we will take it from here. What did the most common ale in England actually taste like before hops existed? How did the Romans accidentally poison their wealthiest citizens with the most expensive wine on the table? What was growing in the hedgerows that could make you believe you were flying? Why were medieval women fined for brewing, but never actually stopped from doing it? What was the church burning inside those stone walls during services that a modern neuroscience lab has since confirmed is psychoactive? Could a physician in the 14th century describe addiction without having a word for it? How much of a laborer's weekly wage disappeared in a single evening at the alehouse? And what was the one plant that every navy on Earth depended on that almost nobody today associates with getting high? Congratulations. You have just woken up in the late medieval period with a thick head and a dry mouth, and a vague memory of something herbal. The landlady downstairs is already brewing. The apothecary is already grinding, and the day has not even started yet. And the first thing we need to do is deal with a lie you have been told so many times it feels like a fact. You have heard it in school, you have heard it in documentaries, you have probably repeated it yourself at a dinner party without thinking twice. Medieval people drank beer instead of water because the water would kill them. It sounds perfectly reasonable. It has that lovely ring of confident historical trivia that makes the person saying it sound well read. And it is, with enormous respect to everyone who has ever repeated it, almost entirely wrong. People in the medieval world drank water. They drank it constantly. They drank it from wells and springs and rivers and municipal conduits, built specifically to carry clean water into towns. London had a system of lead pipes and public fountains running fresh water from springs in the hills north of the city by the 13th century. The Great Conduit, completed in 1285, carried water from Tyburn all the way to Cheapside, and Londoners used it every single day without dying in significant numbers. Paris had public fountains fed by aqueducts. Bruges had an elaborate canal system that supplied fresh water to public taps across the city. These were not accidental arrangements. They were engineered, maintained, and paid for with public money, because medieval city governments understood that clean water was a civic necessity and invested accordingly. Monasteries, those great engines of practical engineering, built some of the most sophisticated water systems in Europe. Canterbury Cathedral Priory had a water system in the 12th century, with settling tanks, filtration channels, and separate pipes for drinking water and wastewater that would not have embarrassed a Victorian sanitary engineer. The monks who designed these systems understood perfectly well that some water was clean and some water was not. They did not need germ theory to figure this out. They had eyes and noses and centuries of accumulated observation, and the observation was straightforward. Water from that spring is clear and sweet, and nobody who drinks it gets sick. Water from that ditch is cloudy and smells like something died in it, which something probably did, and you should not put it in your mouth. There were even water carriers. people whose paid profession was transporting clean water from good sources to customers who could not easily fetch it themselves. You do not build a paid profession around delivering a product that nobody uses. The existence of professional water carriers in medieval London and Paris, and dozens of other cities, is, by itself, enough to put the myth to rest. But the myth persists anyway. For the same reason the claim that you need 8 glasses of water a day persists. It sounds scientific, everyone repeats it, and nobody checks. The idea that medieval Europeans wandered around in a fog of ignorance, unable to distinguish a clean spring from an open sewer, is a fantasy invented largely by Victorian writers who needed the Middle Ages to be as dirty and stupid as possible so their own era could look enlightened by comparison. It is the historical equivalent of someone today assuming that people in rural communities have no idea where their food comes from, condescending, inaccurate, and suspiciously convenient for the person making the claim. So if water was available, and people drank it, why was ale everywhere? Because ale was not a substitute for water. Ale was food. A gallon of medieval ale contained somewhere in the range of 1,000 to 1,500 calories, depending on how it was brewed. And for a laborer, burning through 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, doing physical work that would break a modern gym enthusiast by lunchtime, those calories mattered enormously. Ale was liquid bread. It was a cheap, efficient way to get grain calories into a working body, and it tasted considerably better than chewing through another bowl of the same grain boiled into porridge for the 4th day running. You would drink water when you were thirsty. You would drink ale when you needed fuel. The two were not in competition. They served completely different purposes, and everyone at the time understood this perfectly well. The weak ale that most people drank daily, called small ale or small beer, had an alcohol content so low it would barely register on a modern breathalyzer. Somewhere around 1 to 2%. You could drink it all day, and the main effect would be caloric, not intoxicating. It was closer to a slightly fermented grain smoothie than to anything you would recognize as beer. A modern craft brewery would not even bother putting it on the menu. The stronger stuff existed, certainly, and we will get to that. But the everyday drink that people consumed at breakfast, at midday, and with their evening meal was a nutritional product that happened to be mildly alcoholic, not an alcoholic product that happened to contain nutrition. This distinction matters for everything that follows tonight, because once you understand that the baseline relationship between medieval people and intoxicants was practical, informed, and surprisingly sensible, the genuinely wild parts of this story become much more interesting. These were not ignorant people stumbling through a haze. These were people who understood their substances with remarkable precision, who made deliberate choices about what to consume and why, and who built economic and social systems around intoxication that were every bit as sophisticated as anything operating today. Now, about that ale you are drinking, let us talk about what is actually in it, because it is not what you think. The ale in your cup right now, if you are standing anywhere in England before roughly the 15th century, does not contain hops. This is important. The drink you are holding is not beer. It is ale. And in this period, those are two completely different things. Beer is made with hops. Ale is made without them. And ale, the older drink, the drink that dominated English life for centuries, was flavored with something far more interesting. It was called gruit. Gruit was a blend of herbs and plants used to flavor and preserve ale before hops took over, and its exact composition was one of the most closely guarded commercial secrets in medieval Europe. The base ingredients varied by region, but the most common were bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary. Sometimes marsh mint, sometimes heather, sometimes other things that the people controlling the recipe had no particular incentive to disclose. And here is where it gets quietly fascinating. Several of those plants, bog myrtle and yarrow in particular, have mild psychoactive properties. Yarrow contains thujone, the same compound found in wormwood, the notorious ingredient in absinthe. bog myrtle has a long folk history as a mild narcotic and stimulant. Nobody was writing this on the label. There was no label. But the practical effect was that gruit ale did not feel the same as hopped beer. The experience was different. The warmth hit differently. The relaxation had a slightly different quality to it. And generations of drinkers knew this, even if they could not have explained the chemistry. They did not need to explain the chemistry. They just knew that the ale from the brewer who used the good gruit felt better than the ale from the brewer who skimped on it. And the gruit itself was not free. In much of Northern Europe, the right to produce and sell gruit was a monopoly held by the local lord or the local bishop. It was called the Gruutrecht, and it was essentially a licensing fee on the single most important ingredient in the single most consumed product in the economy. You could not legally brew ale for sale without buying your gruit from the monopoly holder. The price of gruit was whatever the monopoly holder said it was, and the monopoly holder had absolutely no incentive to tell you exactly what was in it, because the mystery was part of the business model. This is the medieval equivalent of a proprietary formula. Think of it as a franchise fee for a recipe nobody outside the franchise is allowed to see, except the product it protected was mildly psychoactive, and the conversation about that particular detail was one that nobody in a position of authority was especially eager to have. When hops arrived, slowly, from the continent, they offered a number of practical advantages. Hopped beer lasted longer. It was easier to standardize. It traveled better. It could be brewed in larger batches without the same spoilage risk. But hops also disrupted the gruit monopoly, because hops were a plant you could grow yourself. They were not a secret proprietary blend controlled by an institution. The shift from gruit to hops was, underneath all the technical arguments about preservation and flavor, an economic revolution. It broke a monopoly, and the institutions that held that monopoly fought the transition for decades, sometimes centuries, using legal restrictions, guild regulations, and moral arguments about the proper way to brew. The beer versus ale debate in medieval Europe was not a culinary preference. It was a trade war. You take a long drink of your gruit ale. It is thick, slightly sweet, a little sour, and nothing at all like the crisp, bitter, carbonated product sitting in a modern refrigerator. The ale is flat. It is warm, because cold storage is not a realistic option for anyone you know. It is cloudy with suspended grain particles, and has a color somewhere between pale amber and murky gold, depending on the grain used and the brewer's technique. It tastes like liquid bread with herbal notes that are hard to place, something earthy and aromatic and just slightly strange. It is not unpleasant, it is actually quite good, in the way that a rough cider or a farmhouse brew is good, honest, and full and alive, in a way that a factory product never quite manages. And the warmth that spreads through your chest after the first deep drink is not just the alcohol. There is something else in there, something gentle and herbal and slightly fuzzy around the edges, and nobody around you seems to think this is worth commenting on. The ale will be bad by Thursday. It was brewed on Monday. Ale without hops spoils within days, which means brewing is not an occasional event in this village. It is a constant, rolling process. Someone is always brewing. The smell of malt and warm grain and working yeast is a permanent feature of the air, as reliable as wood smoke and livestock. And the person doing most of that brewing, the person whose labor keeps the entire village supplied with its primary caloric beverage, is almost certainly a woman. Which brings us to the alewife, and to one of the most quietly extraordinary economic stories in English history. She is standing in her house, which is also her brewery, which is also her shop. The distinction between domestic space and commercial space does not exist here in any meaningful way. She brews in the same room where she cooks meals for her family, using the same hearth, the same fuel, and often the same grain. The equipment is basic: a large vessel for mashing grain, a smaller one for fermenting the liquid. wooden buckets, a straining cloth, perhaps a few ceramic jugs for serving. The technology has not changed significantly in centuries, because it does not need to. The process works. You soak the grain, you let it germinate, you dry it to halt the germination, you mash it with hot water to release the sugars, you strain the liquid off, you let it ferment. The yeast comes from the air and from the residue, clinging to the inside of the last batch's vessel. The skill is in the timing, the temperature, and the proportions, and a good alewife knows her craft the way a good baker knows dough, by feel, by smell, by the sound the liquid makes as it works. She is required by law to display an ale stake outside her door when she has fresh ale for sale. This is a long pole, sometimes decorated with a bush of ivy or greenery, pushed out horizontally from the front of the house as a signal to passers-by. If you see the stake, she is open for business. If you do not, she has nothing ready, or she is not selling today. It is the medieval equivalent of a neon open sign, except it also serves a regulatory function. The stake tells the ale taster where to go. The ale taster is an actual official municipal role, and it is exactly as wonderful as it sounds. He is appointed by the local court or the manor, and his job is to visit every alewife who displays her stake, taste the product, assess its quality and strength, and confirm that she is selling at the correct price according to the assize of ale. The assize is a piece of royal legislation, updated periodically, that ties the price of ale directly to the current price of grain. When grain is cheap, ale must be cheap. When grain is expensive, ale can cost more, but only within the formula's limits. The alewife has no say in setting her own price. She sells at the assize price, or she pays a fine. And the fines are where the story gets genuinely interesting, because alewives were fined constantly. The court records across medieval England show a pattern so consistent it stops looking like punishment and starts looking like a tax. The same women appear in the same courts, paying the same fines, term after term after term. A penny here, 2p there. They are not being shut down. They are not being warned and released. They are simply paying, routinely and predictably, and then continuing to brew the following week. The fines were a revenue stream for the manor court. They were a licensing fee disguised as a penalty, collected at regular intervals from women who had no realistic way to stop paying and no alternative livelihood available that would replace the income from brewing. And the income was significant. An alewife working steadily could earn more than many male laborers in her village. A skilled carpenter in the 14th century earned around 5 or 6p a day. An alewife selling a few gallons at a penny, or penny halfpenny per gallon, brewing several times a week, could match or exceed that income. The margins were thin on any single batch, a few pence profit after the cost of grain and fuel and gruit. But the volume was constant, because the demand was constant. Everyone drank ale, every day, every meal. Multiply a small margin by an entire village, drinking your product several times a week, and the numbers add up to something genuinely substantial. In many households, the alewife's brewing income was not a supplement to her husband's earnings. It was the primary revenue. She was not helping the family economy. She was running it. But follow the money upstream from her hands, and the picture changes. The gruit had to be purchased from the monopoly holder at whatever price the monopoly holder set. The grain had to be bought at market prices she could not control, prices that swung wildly with the harvest and hit her twice, once when she bought the grain, and again when the assize adjusted her selling price downward if grain happened to be cheap that season. The fuel for the hearth, usually wood or peat or dried dung, cost money or hours of gathering labor. The assize locked her retail price. The ale taster checked her product, and his fee came out of her earnings. The court collected fines, whether or not she had actually done anything wrong, because the fines were not really about wrongdoing. They were about revenue. Everyone upstream of her took their cut. The lord through the gruit tax, the crown through the assize framework. the taster through his appointment fee, the court through its fines, and the alewife absorbed whatever remained after all of them had eaten. When a batch spoiled, which happened regularly because unhopped ale has a shelf life measured in days, and the English weather was not always cooperative, she absorbed that loss entirely. Nobody upstream refunded anything. Nobody adjusted her next fine downward because her last batch went sour. The risk sat entirely on her shoulders, and the rewards were distributed across every institution that touched her trade. She was the one who did the labor. She was the one who carried the risk. She was the one who faced the court when the numbers did not add up. And she was the one who, over the course of the 15th and 16th centuries, was slowly, systematically pushed out of the industry she had built. The shift happened in stages, and it happened for reasons that sounded perfectly rational at each step. Hopped beer lasted longer than unhopped ale, which meant larger batches were commercially viable, which meant brewing could move from a cottage industry to a dedicated commercial operation. Larger batches required bigger equipment. Bigger equipment required more capital. More capital required access to credit and guild membership. And guilds were, with very few exceptions, closed to women. Not always explicitly. Sometimes the barrier was a requirement to have completed a formal apprenticeship that women were not admitted to. Sometimes it was a capital threshold that a woman without independent property rights could not meet. Sometimes it was simply the quiet, persistent exclusion that required no written rule because everyone understood the unwritten one. The professionalization of brewing was not a gender-neutral process of economic efficiency. It was the transfer of an entire industry from female hands to male ones, accomplished not through any dramatic act of prohibition, but through the quiet, grinding mechanics of capital requirements, guild restrictions, and institutional gatekeeping. The alewife did not lose her trade because she brewed badly. She lost it because the rules of the game changed around her in ways that made it impossible for her to keep playing. By the time the great commercial breweries of the 16th and 17th centuries were established, the alewife had been written out of the story so completely that her primary surviving image in popular culture was a negative one: the dishonest brewer. The woman who watered down the ale, who cheated on the measure, who sold bad product to unsuspecting customers. She appears in morality plays and woodcuts as a stock villain, a comic figure of petty dishonesty, destined for punishment. It is one of the neatest historical erasures you will find anywhere. Build an industry, run it for centuries, get pushed out of it by people with more capital and more institutional access, and then get remembered, by history, as the person who was doing it badly all along. The cucking stool is where the story darkens. This was a punishment device, a chair mounted on a beam that could be swung out over a river or pond and plunged into the water, and it was associated specifically with women convicted of brewing offenses, of being a common scold, or of other violations that amounted to a woman being too loud, too visible, or too commercially independent for the comfort of the authorities. The cucking stool was not applied to male brewers. It was not applied to monks. It was a gendered punishment for an economic activity that happened to be dominated by women, and its existence tells you everything you need to know about whose intoxication the law was concerned with controlling and whose it was content to ignore. The alehouse is getting quieter now. The fire has burned low, and the shadows are stretching long across the packed earth floor. Your cup is nearly empty, and the alewife is already calculating whether to brew again tomorrow or let the grain stretch another day. The economics never stop turning in her head. They cannot afford to. But ale, for all its significance, was only the common drink, the everyday fuel. If you wanted something with more prestige, more complexity, more danger, and a considerably higher price, you looked elsewhere. You looked south, across the water, to the vineyards. And you asked a very simple question that turned out to have a very complicated answer. What exactly is in this wine? The answer, it turns out, is almost anything. If you are drinking wine anywhere in the ancient or medieval world, the liquid in your cup has been through things. The modern expectation of wine, that clean, carefully regulated product, sealed in glass, with a label telling you exactly what grape it came from, and which hillside that grape grew on, does not apply here, not even slightly. Wine in the ancient world was routinely mixed with resin, seawater, honey, herbs, lead, chalk, pitch, and whatever else the producer or the merchant decided would improve the flavor, extend the shelf life, or disguise the fact that the product had already started turning to vinegar. The bottle of wine sitting in your kitchen right now is the end result of centuries of increasingly strict regulation designed to stop people from doing to wine what people in the ancient world did to wine as a matter of course. Start with the Greeks, because they set the template. Greek wine was almost never consumed straight. It was mixed with water at specific ratios, and we will get to the elaborate social rules around that in a moment. But before the water was even added, the wine itself was frequently infused with pine resin. If you have ever tasted Retsina, that sharp, piney Greek wine that tourists either love immediately or politely leave on the table after one cautious sip, you are drinking a living fossil. Retsina is the last surviving echo of a practice that was standard across the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. The resin helped preserve the wine in the porous clay amphorae used for storage and transport, sealing the interior surface and slowing oxidation, and over time, the taste became so expected that wine without it seemed flat and incomplete. The preservative became the flavor. The workaround became the tradition. The same way a barbecue pitmaster today would tell you the smoke is not a byproduct, but the entire point. The Romans took this further, because the Romans took everything further. Roman wine production was an industrial operation spanning the entire Mediterranean basin, and the range of additives used at various stages of production and sale would make a modern food safety inspector weep quietly into a clipboard. Seawater was added to certain wines as a flavoring agent and preservative, particularly in coastal regions where the practice had been refined over generations. Marble dust and powdered chalk were stirred in to reduce acidity in wines that had come out too sharp. Herbs and spices were infused to create flavored varieties for different occasions and different price points. Some wines were aged deliberately. Others were doctored to taste as if they had been. The line between winemaking and wine fabrication was not one that Roman consumers spent much time worrying about. And then there was defrutum, which is where the story takes a genuinely dark turn. Defrutum was a thick, sweet syrup made by boiling grape must down to a fraction of its original volume, concentrating the sugars into a dense, intensely flavored reduction. The preferred vessel for this process was a lead pot or a lead-lined vessel, and this preference was not accidental. Lead reacts with the organic acids in grape juice to produce lead acetate, a compound that is intensely, almost unnervingly sweet. The Romans called it sugar of lead, and they loved it. They stirred it into wine to balance bitterness and add sweetness. They drizzled it over fruit and cooked it into sauces. They used it as a general-purpose flavor enhancer, the way a modern cook reaches for salt or a pinch of sugar to round out a dish. Recipes in the Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius call for defrutum repeatedly, casually, the way a modern recipe calls for stock or butter, and it was, of course, profoundly poisonous. Lead acetate causes cumulative organ damage, neurological deterioration, kidney failure, infertility, gout, cognitive decline, and a constellation of chronic symptoms that Roman physicians documented extensively in their patients without ever connecting those symptoms to the sweet syrup that the same patients were consuming enthusiastically at every meal. The lead theory of Roman decline is debated among historians, and you will find scholars on every side of the argument about how much lead exposure contributed to broader social and political deterioration. But the basic chemistry is not in dispute. They were sweetening their finest wine with a lead compound and drinking it daily for centuries. Here is the status flip buried in this. The most expensive product on the table was the one most likely to be slowly poisoning you. The cheap local stuff, the rough vinegar wine that laborers drank from communal jugs, was not worth adulterating. Nobody was wasting expensive lead sweetener or imported spices on a product sold for a few copper coins. The premium wine got the premium treatment. The premium treatment included lead. The poor drinker, nursing his cheap sour wine in the corner, was the one whose liver was going to survive the decade. Paying more did not buy you safety. It bought you flavor, prestige, and a higher dose of something that was quietly destroying you from the inside. The most dangerous drink in Rome was the most expensive one. This pattern carried forward into the medieval period, with different poisons but the same basic logic. Medieval wine merchants were notorious adulterators, and the evidence comes not from their critics, but from the regulations designed to stop them. Regulations that would not have existed if the problem were not widespread and persistent. The Gascon wine shipped from Bordeaux to England, the backbone of the medieval English wine trade for centuries, traveled in wooden casks across the Bay of Biscay on ships that offered no temperature control and no gentle handling. The wine arrived in English ports in varying states of quality. Some of it was excellent, well made, and well preserved, the genuine product of one of the finest wine regions in Europe. Some of it had started to turn during the voyage, shifted by heat and motion and time into something trending unmistakably toward vinegar. And the merchant who received a cask of wine trending toward vinegar did not pour it into the gutter and write off the loss. He fixed it. Honey was stirred in to mask sourness and add body. Elderberry juice was added to deepen the color of wine that had faded to an unappetizing brown. Ground pepper and ginger disguised off flavors with a kick of spice that the customer might even interpret as a feature. Sometimes, the wine was simply blended with a stronger, better batch until the result was drinkable enough to sell without complaint. The customer paid for imported Gascon wine and received a creative interpretation of the concept. The label, if there had been one, would have required several footnotes. The cost of that wine, even in its adulterated state, was staggering by the standards of a working person. A gallon of decent imported wine in 14th century England might cost 8 pence or more. A gallon of the very best wine, the sweet wines from the Mediterranean that commanded premium prices at noble tables, could run to 2 shillings or more. A skilled carpenter, earning 5 or 6 pence a day, would need to hand over more than a full day's wages for a single gallon of ordinary imported wine. For the premium stuff, 3 or 4 days, an entire working week, paid out in a single evening of wine at a merchant's table, and the product itself might be watered down, doctored with elderberry, or sweetened with honey to hide the fact that it had been sitting in a warehouse too long. Meanwhile, the same carpenter could buy a gallon of good ale for a penny, maybe a penny halfpenny for the strong stuff. The arithmetic was not subtle. Wine was a luxury that announced itself in every sip, and the people who drank it regularly wanted everyone in the room to understand what that meant about their position in the world. Hippocras was the ultimate expression of this logic. It was a spiced wine preparation, made by steeping cinnamon, ginger, long pepper, cloves, grains of paradise, and sugar in good quality wine, and then straining the result through a cloth bag, sometimes multiple times, until the liquid ran clear and the spices had given up every particle of their flavor. Hippocras was served at the end of a feast as both a digestive aid and a display of extravagant wealth, because every single ingredient in it was imported and expensive. The cinnamon had traveled from Sri Lanka or southern China, the ginger from Southeast Asia, the cloves from the Moluccas, a tiny cluster of islands so remote that most Europeans could not have pointed to them on a map. The sugar, still a luxury spice in its own right, had come from plantations in the eastern Mediterranean or North Africa. A single batch of hippocras required spices that had collectively traveled tens of thousands of miles along trade routes involving dozens of middlemen, and the cost of those spices alone could represent several days of a craftsman's wages before you even accounted for the wine they were steeped in. Hippocras was not adulterated wine. It was wine deliberately, lavishly transformed into something richer, and it was genuinely delicious by any standard, a warm, complex, sweet, aromatic drink that tasted like celebration itself, but it was also a drink that existed primarily to demonstrate that the host could afford to make it. The flavor was real, and the pleasure was real. The point was the price. And the rules about how you drank, what you drank, and who you drank with were never casual. They were loaded with meaning, governed by ritual, and enforced by social pressure that could be every bit as powerful as any written law. Step back a few centuries from the medieval alehouse, across the Mediterranean, and deep into the ancient world, and you find the most elaborately codified drinking culture in recorded history. The Greek symposium was not a party. Or rather, it was a party in the way that a state dinner is a party. Technically festive, actually political, extremely choreographed. There was a room, usually the andron, the men's dining room in a wealthy household, furnished with couches arranged around the walls in a specific configuration that dictated who sat where and what that seating implied about their status. There was food, served and cleared before the serious business of the evening began. And then there was wine, mixed with water in a large communal vessel called a crater, and the ratio of water to wine was not a matter of personal preference. It was a decision made for the entire room by a single person, and that person's authority for the evening was absolute. The symposiarch was elected at the start of the drinking portion of the evening. His job was to determine the mixing ratio, set the pace of drinking, decide the order of toasts and entertainment, and generally conduct the room through the evening with a steady hand. This was not a ceremonial role. The symposiarch had genuine authority, and the social consequences of ignoring his decisions were severe. If he declared a ratio of 3 parts water to 1 part wine, that was the ratio for the room. If he decided the mood warranted a shift to 2 parts water to 1 part wine, the room shifted. If he called for a round, you drank. Refusing was an insult not just to the symposiarch personally, but to the entire company, an act of social defiance that marked you as someone who could not be trusted to participate in collective life. Drinking your wine undiluted was considered barbaric, not metaphorically. The Greeks genuinely associated the consumption of unmixed wine with the Scythians, the Thracians, and other peoples they classified as uncivilized, and the act of diluting wine with water was understood as a fundamental marker of Greek cultural identity and rational self-governance. You diluted your wine because you were civilized. You diluted your wine because you understood that the point of the symposium was sustained, controlled, articulate sociability, not obliteration. The ideal state was a warm, loosened conviviality that allowed for good conversation, philosophical debate, poetry recitation, singing, and the occasional round of kottabos, which was a drinking game that involved flicking the dregs of your wine cup at a small bronze target balanced on a stand across the room. It was competitive, it was messy, it stained the furniture, and it was considered a perfectly respectable entertainment for the educated elite of the most culturally sophisticated civilization in the Mediterranean. Some of the finest painted pottery to survive from ancient Greece depicts kottabos in progress, which tells you something about how seriously they took it. The symposiarch was, when you strip away the historical distance, the friend who decides the group is doing shots now. Except in Athens, he was formally elected, and his word was socially binding for the duration of the evening. The pressure to match the room's drinking pace, the quiet anxiety of falling behind, or getting conspicuously ahead, the performative ease of someone who is 3 cups deep and pretending they are handling it beautifully, the slight edge of judgment directed at the person who keeps sipping water between rounds. All of this is every office happy hour, every wedding reception open bar, every work dinner where someone is quietly counting their colleagues' glasses and adjusting their own pace accordingly. The social physics of communal drinking have not changed in 3,000 years. The couches became chairs. The crater became a pitcher. The cotabos became darts. The anxiety is identical. This carried forward into medieval drinking culture, with different furniture, but the same underlying mechanics. The communal cup passed around a table in a specific order carried the same freight of social obligation. Refusing to drink from the shared cup was a statement, and sometimes a dangerous one. The loving cup tradition, still surviving in ceremonial form today, used a large two-handled vessel passed between drinkers with specific gestures of trust. You held the handles while you drank, and the person standing to your side faced outward, watching the room on your behalf, because tilting your head back to drink meant closing your eyes and exposing your throat. The ritual encoded a real vulnerability. The gesture said, "I am undefended right now, and I trust you not to harm me." The subtext was political. The drink was the medium. The message was loyalty. Guild feasts had mandatory drinking rounds, and the records are quite specific about this. Missing a round was noted. Missing a feast entirely was fined. The amount of ale or wine consumed at a guild function was not incidental to the business of social bonding. It was the mechanism of the social bonding. Being seen to drink with your peers, at the same pace, from the same supply, neither hanging back nor racing ahead, was a performance of solidarity, equality, and trustworthiness. The brewer who could not keep up, and the merchant who refused to keep up, were both, in their different ways, failing the same test. They were demonstrating that they could not be relied upon to do as the group did, and in a world where guild membership was your livelihood, that was not a small thing. And the morning after a guild feast, when your head was thick and your stomach was making promises it had no intention of keeping, you went back to work in a world where the most effective painkiller available was sitting on an open shelf in the apothecary shop down the street. No appointment, no prescription, no questions asked, just a transaction between you and a professional who had exactly what you needed and no reason on earth not to sell it to you. Because opium, in the medieval world, was not a secret. It was not a scandal. It was not an underground commodity whispered about in dark corners by shadowy figures. It was medicine, ordinary, widely available, completely legal medicine, sold openly and prescribed freely by physicians who considered it one of the most valuable tools in their entire professional repertoire. The poppy has been with humanity for a staggeringly long time. The Sumerians, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets roughly 5,000 years ago, referred to it as whole gill, the joy plant. This was not a poetic metaphor. It was not a spiritual name assigned by priests in a ceremonial context. It was a practical, descriptive label applied by people who cultivated the plant, processed it, and used the result. They knew what it did, and they named it for what it did. The joy plant. Clear, honest, accurate. Egyptian medical papyri from the 2nd millennium before the Common Era include opium in prescriptions for ailments ranging from surgical pain to persistent headaches to, remarkably, crying children. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most complete surviving medical documents from ancient Egypt, contains a preparation of poppy mixed with fly dung that had been strained through cloth to be administered to infants who cried excessively. The dosage instructions were precise. The attitude was clinical. The same papyrus includes remedies for eye disease, skin conditions, digestive complaints, and gynecological problems. And the opium preparation for crying infants sits among them with no special emphasis, no warning, no moral commentary. It was medicine, and it worked, and that was sufficient. Greek physicians built on this foundation with characteristic thoroughness. Dioscorides, writing his monumental Pharmacopoeia in the 1st century, catalogued opium preparations with the same methodical precision he applied to every other substance in his 5-volume work. He described the harvesting method in detail. The scoring of the unripe poppy capsule with a sharp blade, the shallow cuts made carefully to avoid penetrating too deep, the collection of the milky white sap that bled slowly from those cuts and dried on the surface of the capsule into a dark, gummy resin, the drying process. The various ways the finished product could be dissolved, diluted, combined with other substances, and administered to patients. He noted its extraordinary power to relieve pain, induce sleep, suppress coughs, and calm the distressed mind. He also noted, with the same even professional tone, that excessive use could depress breathing and kill. The information was complete. The tone was practical. This was a tool, described for professionals who would use it with appropriate care. Galen, the most influential physician in the ancient world, a man whose writings shaped European medicine for well over 1,000 years after his death, prescribed opium enthusiastically and often. His compound medicines, the famous Galenic preparations that dominated every pharmacy and every medical school in Europe through the medieval period and into the Renaissance, frequently included opium as a key active ingredient. He prescribed it for pain of every kind, for insomnia, for digestive complaints and intestinal cramping, for eye inflammation, for ear infections, for chronic cough, for melancholy and emotional distress. The range of conditions he treated with opium-based preparations was so broad that it starts to feel less like a specific remedy and more like a general solution to the problem of being a human body in an uncomfortable world, which, if you think about it honestly, is not entirely inaccurate. By the medieval period, opium had been woven into one of the most famous and widely used compound medicines in European history. Theriac, sometimes called treacle or theriaca, was a preparation containing anywhere from 40 to over 70 ingredients, depending on the recipe, the era, and the city of manufacture. Opium was consistently among the core ingredients, regardless of which version you encountered. Theriac was prescribed for essentially everything: plague, snakebite, poisoning of all kinds, melancholy, stomach ailments, fever, general weakness, difficulty sleeping, chronic pain, and, more or less, any other condition a patient might present with. Because if the first 69 ingredients did not address the problem, the opium almost certainly took the edge off. The reputation of Theriac was so exalted that cities competed fiercely over whose preparation was the most authentic, the most carefully compounded, and the most effective. Venice, in particular, transformed Theriac production into a matter of civic identity and commercial prestige, with public preparation ceremonies held in the open air where the ingredients were displayed, verified by inspectors, and compounded in full view of witnesses to prove their quality and authenticity. It was pharmaceutical theater, it was marketing, and it worked, because Venetian Theriac commanded premium prices across Europe for centuries. An apothecary stocking opium preparations, alongside cough syrups and digestive tonics, is not as far from a modern pharmacy as you might want to believe. The packaging has changed. The regulatory framework has changed enormously. The supply chain has gotten longer and more opaque. But the fundamental transaction, the one that has been replaying in every culture that discovered the poppy, is identical. I am in pain. I cannot sleep. I need relief. Sell me something that works. The apothecary sold it. The physician prescribed it. The patient used it. And for the vast majority of recorded history, nobody involved in this exchange thought they were doing anything remotely unusual, dangerous, or morally complicated. It was simply medicine, doing what medicine was for. The poppy grew well across a wide band from the Mediterranean through Central Asia, and its products moved through a chain of hands that stretched from the farmer who tended the crop to the traveling merchant who carried the raw material over mountain passes and sea routes, to the urban apothecary who compounded the final preparation in his shop. At each stage, a markup was applied. The farmer earned the least. The long-distance merchant took the largest share of the risk and a corresponding share of the profit. The apothecary, compounding the raw material into finished preparations with the expertise and the guild credentials to charge for his knowledge, applied the final and often the most significant markup. A simple poppy preparation, affordable to almost anyone who could scrape together a few coins, cost pennies. A dose of Venetian theriac, with its dozens of imported ingredients, and its reputation for near-miraculous efficacy, and its civic branding, could cost more than a laborer earned in a week. The assumption that opium was exotic, rare, or shameful in the medieval world is a modern projection, laid backward onto people who would have found it baffling. Opium was not hidden. It was not whispered about. It was discussed openly in medical texts available to any literate person, sold openly in shops on ordinary streets, and used openly by patients from every level of society. The secrecy, the stigma, the criminalization, all of that came later, much later. And the story of how a substance went from being the most trusted medicine in the physician's arsenal to one of the most feared substances in modern law is a story about politics and economics and cultural anxiety, far more than it is a story about the substance itself. But opium was just one item on a very long shelf. And that shelf, the medieval apothecary's actual working shelf, deserves a proper visit of its own, because if you thought the range of mind-altering substances available to an ordinary person in the ancient and medieval world stopped at ale, wine, and poppy preparations, you are about to discover that you have barely even started. The apothecary's shop finds you before you find it. The smell reaches you from halfway down the lane, a dense, layered wave of dried herbs, ground spices, animal fat, beeswax, something floral, something bitter, something sharp and resinous that catches in the back of your throat and refuses to leave. It is not unpleasant exactly. It is overwhelming in the way that walking into a perfume department is overwhelming. Except here, every single scent is doing something to a human body, and the man behind the counter can tell you precisely what. Every surface in this shop is working. Bundles of dried plants hang from the ceiling beams in thick clusters, slowly releasing their volatile oils into the warm air. Ceramic jars line the shelves behind the counter in rows, each one stoppered with wax or cork and labeled in abbreviated Latin that only the apothecary and his apprentice are expected to read. Wooden drawers hold powders and dried roots and fragments of bark and seeds and resins and things you cannot identify by sight and probably would not want identified by smell. A small brass scale sits on the counter next to a marble mortar and pestle, worn smooth and stained dark from years of daily grinding. The whole room feels like a library of substances, organized by a system you are not quite qualified to understand, but can sense, operating beneath every surface. The man behind the counter has spent years learning this system. He served an apprenticeship, usually 7 years, under a master apothecary who taught him to identify, prepare, compound, and dose every substance on these shelves. He can tell you by sight and smell whether a batch of dried henbane is fresh enough to use or too old to trust. He can grind a compound in specific proportions from memory. He knows which substances are safe to combine and which combinations will kill. In many cities, he belongs to a guild that regulates who can sell what and at what price. And the guild takes its reputation with an almost aggressive seriousness, because the line between an apothecary and a physician is a professional boundary the apothecary has to defend constantly from both sides. Physicians diagnose and prescribe. Apothecaries compound and sell. In theory, the distinction is clean, and everyone stays in their lane. In practice, the apothecary sees more patients in a week than most physicians see in a month, because the apothecary is accessible, affordable, and standing right there behind a counter with the remedy already on the shelf. The physician charges a consultation fee before he even begins to think about what might be wrong with you. The apothecary charges you for the product and throws in the advice for free. For the vast majority of people in the medieval world, the apothecary was the primary, and often the only, point of contact with anything resembling professional healthcare. And the range of what he could sell you is where tonight's story starts to accelerate. You already know about opium. You know about theriac and the poppy preparations sitting in their ceramic jars with their careful Latin labels. But the shelf does not stop there, not even close. Start at one end and work your way slowly across, and you find a pharmacopoeia so extensive, so varied, and so casually psychoactive that the modern distinction between medicine and recreational substance dissolves almost completely. Here is henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, dried and ground, and ready to be compounded into ointments and plasters and poultices. Henbane contains hyoscyamine and scopolamine, tropane alkaloids that produce sedation, pain relief, hallucination, and delirium, depending on the dose and the method of preparation. Medieval physicians prescribed henbane preparations for toothache with considerable frequency, because a toothache in the medieval world was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis. There was no dentist in the modern sense. There was no filling, no root canal, no anesthetic injection. There was pain, and the pain would continue until the tooth was pulled or the nerve died, and in the meantime, henbane offered genuine relief. Henbane ointment rubbed into the gum numbed the area. Henbane plaster applied to the jaw drew the pain outward, or at least that was the theory, and the patient felt better, which was the only result that mattered. But the dose that eased a toothache and the dose that tipped you into a vivid, disorienting hallucinatory state were not far apart. A few drops too many in the preparation, a miscalculation in the grinding, a batch of henbane that happened to be more potent than the last, and the patient went from pain relief to a waking nightmare of distorted vision, racing heart, and images that were not there. The apothecary knew this, which is precisely why he controlled the preparation, and you did not grind your own. His expertise was not just in knowing what to use, it was in knowing how much. The margin was everything. Here is mandrake, Mandragora officinarum, the root that launched 1,000 legends. Mandrake contains the same tropane alkaloids as henbane, in different proportions and concentrations, and its thick, forking root occasionally grows in a shape that resembles a human figure, which is all the medieval imagination needed to build an entire mythology around the plant that persisted for centuries. The idea that mandrake screamed when pulled from the ground, killing anyone who heard the sound, is a folk belief that appears in texts from the 1st century onward, and was still being repeated with apparent sincerity in herbals written 1,000 years later. The recommended solution, described in multiple sources with the matter-of-fact tone of practical advice, was to tie a hungry dog to the root with a length of cord, place food just out of the dog's reach, and walk away to a safe distance. The dog would lunge for the food, uproot the mandrake, absorb the fatal shriek, and die. You would then collect the root at your leisure. The root was real, the alkaloids were real and potent, the screaming was not. But the mythology served a practical commercial purpose that was very real indeed. It made mandrake seem rare, dangerous, and impossibly powerful, which justified a higher price at market and kept casual, untrained users away from a genuinely hazardous substance. The mystique was marketing, effective marketing. In practice, mandrake was used as a sedative and a pain reliever by physicians who understood the plant's actual properties and ignored the theatrical folklore. Mandrake appears in surgical texts as a key component of soporific sponges, the direct ancestor of the dwale preparation we will return to shortly. A sponge was soaked in a carefully measured mixture of mandrake juice, opium, hemlock, henbane, and sometimes other sedative herbs, then dried for storage. Before surgery, the sponge was moistened with warm water or vinegar to reactivate the compounds and held under the patient's nose until unconsciousness arrived. The surgeon then had a narrow, unpredictable window to work before the patient began to stir. Waking the patient involved vinegar fumes held under the nose and fennel juice applied to the temples. The whole procedure reads like a recipe, which is essentially what it was. A recipe for unconsciousness, calibrated by centuries of cautious trial and fatal error, written down and passed between practitioners who understood intimately that the margin between effective sedation and a dead patient was terrifyingly, unforgivingly thin. Here is lettuce. Not the crisp, watery salad leaf sitting in your modern refrigerator, but Lactuca verosa, wild lettuce, sometimes called opium lettuce or lettuce opium, for reasons that become obvious when you score the thick stem and collect the milky white sap that bleeds out. Lacticarium, as the dried sap is called, has mild sedative and analgesic properties. It was prescribed for sleeplessness, for nervous agitation, for mild pain, and for the kind of restless, anxious discomfort that medieval physicians attributed to an excess of hot, dry humors. It was one of the cheaper sleep aids available on the apothecary's shelf, less potent than opium, less dangerous than henbane, and accessible enough that even people of modest means could afford a dose when the night was long and sleep would not come. The apothecary stocked it alongside the heavier substances as a gentler option, the medieval equivalent of choosing a mild over-the-counter sleep aid instead of a prescription sedative. Not everyone who walked through his door needed the strong stuff. Some of them just needed to sleep. And here, finally, is Dwale itself. The preparation mentioned at the very beginning of tonight's video, now revealed in its full and unsettling detail. Dwale was a compound sedative whose recipe appears in multiple medieval medical manuscripts, with minor variations across copies and centuries. The base typically included bile, usually drawn from a pig or a boar, mixed with the juice of henbane, juice of hemlock, juice of wild lettuce, opium dissolved in wine, and occasionally juice of bryony, or a splash of vinegar. The ingredients were combined, heated gently to blend, reduced to concentrate the active compounds, and then either soaked into a sponge for inhalation or administered directly as a drink in measured, cautious doses. The name itself probably derives from an Old English word meaning to stupefy or to make dull, and the substance lived up to the name with terrifying, reliable efficiency. Reading the recipe today, with modern pharmacological knowledge, is a disquieting experience. Hemlock contains coniane, a potent neurotoxin that causes ascending paralysis and ultimately stops the respiratory system. Hemlock contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine, deliriants that suppress consciousness and alter perception. Opium depresses the entire central nervous system. Combined in a single preparation, these substances create a cocktail that could reliably render a person unconscious for surgery, but could just as reliably stop their breathing entirely if the proportions shifted by a small, almost imperceptible degree. The margin for error was measured in drops, not cups, and the apothecary compounding this preparation carried the weight of that knowledge in his hands every single time he prepared a batch. One dose to save a patient from the agony of surgery performed while fully conscious. A slightly different dose to stop their heart. The space between those two outcomes was his professional expertise. It was also the space in which medieval surgery was possible at all. The cost of these preparations varied enormously, and the variation tells you something important about how the medieval pharmacopoeia was organized economically. A simple henbane plaster for a toothache might cost a penny or two. Bearable, for almost anyone, the kind of expense a laborer might grumble about, but could manage when the alternative was another sleepless night with a throbbing jaw. A prepared dose of Dwale for a surgical procedure cost significantly more, reflecting the complexity of the preparation, the number of expensive ingredients, the danger of getting any of them wrong, and the years of expertise required to compound them safely. A full course of high-quality theriac from a reputable urban apothecary could run to several shillings, the equivalent of a week or more of a laborer's total wages, spent on a single course of treatment. The apothecary's shelf was organized, in practical economic terms, by the same logic that governs a modern pharmacy. Simple remedies at the affordable end, compound preparations in the middle, priced to reflect their complexity, and then the premium branded products at the top, the ones with famous names and carefully cultivated reputations, and recipes that were treated as commercial secrets, commanding prices that reflected as much marketing as they did medicine. The individual ingredients that went into a batch of theriac were not dramatically more expensive than the ingredients in simpler compound preparations, but the name theriac, especially Venetian theriac, carried a premium that no generic preparation could command. The brand was worth as much as the substance, a pattern that modern pharmaceutical companies would recognize instantly without needing a single word of explanation. Step out of the apothecary's shop and back into the street, and you realize that the professionalized trade in psychoactive substances was only one layer of a much larger picture. Because the apothecary sold what he sold from a licensed shop, with a guild membership and a trained eye and a carefully maintained professional reputation standing behind every jar on his shelf. But growing all around you, in gardens and hedgerows and untended field margins, and along the edges of footpaths, were plants that needed no apothecary, no formal preparation, and no institutional permission. And some of those plants were growing in places the church itself had sanctified, places where the stone walls were thick, and the windows were small, and the air inside was warm and close, and sweet, with something that the congregation breathed in for hours at a time, without anyone in a position of authority ever asking exactly what it was they were breathing. The temple is dark, not the comfortable dark of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, but a heavy, architectural dark, the kind of dark that stone walls create when the windows are narrow and set high, and the only light comes from oil lamps and candles, whose flames move in the warm air currents rising from the bodies packed into the space. You are standing in a building designed to contain people and contain atmosphere, and the atmosphere in here is thick enough to taste. The incense has been burning for a while now. You noticed it when you entered, a sweet, warm, resinous fragrance that seemed pleasant and appropriate, the expected smell of a sacred space. But you have been standing here for over an hour now, in a room with poor ventilation and a low ceiling, and dozens of other people breathing the same air, and the smell has changed. It has become the air. It is not something layered on top of what you are breathing. It is what you are breathing, and there is a warmth behind your eyes now, a softness in the edges of your vision, a feeling that the candlelight is doing something more than simply illuminating the room. The chanting sounds richer than it did when you arrived. The Latin phrases you do not understand seem to carry meaning anyway, not in the words themselves, but in the vibration of them, the way they resonate in the stone and in your chest. You feel calm, you feel present, you feel, if you are being honest with yourself, slightly altered. Nobody around you is commenting on this. The priest is not commenting on this. The experience of breathing aromatic smoke in an enclosed stone space for an extended period is simply part of what worship feels like, and the line between sacred atmosphere and pharmacological effect is one that nobody in this building has any reason or any vocabulary to draw. But the chemistry does not care about the theology. Frankincense, the most common incense burned in Christian churches for over 1,000 years, contains a compound called insensole acetate. In 2008, a study published in the FACEB journal, one of the most respected publications in experimental biology, demonstrated that insensole acetate activates ion channels in the brain associated with warmth, relaxation, and anxiolytic effects. In the silent depths of the Pacific, ancient submarine canyons carve the seafloor, hiding ecosystems older than human history. The smoke that fills churches during services is not pharmacologically inert. It is doing something to the brains of the people breathing it, something subtle, something warm, something that feels, from the inside, very much like what the faithful have always described as the presence of the divine. This is not a modern discovery projected backward. The ancients knew that certain types of smoke changed how people felt. They did not have the vocabulary of neuroscience, but they had centuries of accumulated observation, and they used what they observed with deliberate precision. Go back further. Go back to Delphi, to the most famous oracle in the ancient world, and you find a case study in the deliberate use of atmosphere to produce altered states. The Pythia, the priestess who delivered Apollo's prophecies, did not simply sit on a stool and speak. She sat on a tripod, positioned directly over a fissure in the rock beneath the temple floor, in a small enclosed chamber called the Adyton. For centuries, scholars debated whether the ancient accounts of the Pythia entering a trance state were literal or literary. Then, in the early 2000s, a team of geologists and archaeologists found the answer underneath the temple itself. The temple at Delphi sits directly above the intersection of two geological fault lines. These faults run through bituminous limestone, a rock formation that, when subjected to the tectonic friction generated by fault activity, releases hydrocarbon gases. The research team, led by geologist Yele de Boer and archaeologist John Hale, identified ethylene and methane among the gases that could have seeped through the fissures and into the enclosed space of the Adyton. Ethylene, in particular, is a sweet-smelling gas that in low concentrations produces a state of mild euphoria, dissociation, and disinhibition. In higher concentrations, it causes unconsciousness and death. The ancient accounts describe the Pythia as sometimes entering a gentle trance and sometimes becoming violently agitated, sometimes speaking coherently, and sometimes babbling incoherently, and the variation makes perfect sense if the intensity of the experience depended on the variable rate of gas emission from an active geological fault. The priests of Apollo did not need to understand geology. They needed to understand that this particular spot, this specific chamber beneath this specific temple, did something to the people who sat in it for long enough. The sacred geography was real. The divine explanation was the framework available to interpret it. And the framework worked beautifully, for both the genuinely altered priestess and for the institution that derived enormous political influence and financial revenue from her pronouncements. Travel south to Egypt, and the chemistry becomes even more deliberate. Kaifi was the sacred incense of the Egyptian temples, and its preparation was not a casual affair. The recipe was literally carved into temple walls, preserved in stone at Edfu and Philae, with the kind of monumental permanence that the Egyptians reserved for things they considered essential to the proper functioning of the cosmos. The ingredients varied by version, but a typical preparation included wine, honey, raisins, pine resin, myrrh, cinnamon, juniper, sweet flag, and several other aromatic botanicals, blended and shaped into pellets that were burned on coals during evening temple rituals. Several of those ingredients have documented psychoactive properties. Sweet flag, Acorus calamus, contains beta-acerone, a compound associated with sedative and mildly hallucinogenic effects. Myrrh has analgesic properties. The combination of multiple aromatic compounds burning simultaneously in an enclosed space creates a pharmacological cocktail whose total effect is greater than any single ingredient would produce alone. The Egyptian priests were burning this compound in small, enclosed inner sanctums where they spent hours performing rituals, and the smoke was understood not as a byproduct of worship, but as the medium through which the gods were reached. The smoke was the point. Breathing it was the practice, and the practice worked, in the specific sense that the priests who breathed it reported experiences consistent with the altered states that the theology predicted. None of this means that ancient religion was secretly just drug use wearing a ceremonial robe. The relationships between sacred architecture, ritual practice, aromatic compounds, and human consciousness are genuine and complex, and reducing them to a simple pharmacological trick misses the deeper point. The deeper point is that sacred spaces were designed, consciously or through accumulated tradition, to alter the state of the people inside them. The darkness, the chanting, the fasting, the physical postures, and yes, the smoke. all worked together to produce an experience that felt fundamentally different from ordinary life. The chemistry was one element of a system that included psychology, architecture, social pressure, sleep deprivation, and genuine belief. The smoke helped. It was not the whole story, but it was a chapter of the story that the institutions burning it had no incentive to examine too closely. The argument that church incense creates a sacred atmosphere without acknowledging its psychoactive chemistry is identical in structure to the argument that communion wine is symbolic rather than alcoholic. Both statements contain a truth and conceal a truth simultaneously. The atmosphere is real, the sacrament is real. The chemistry is also real, and it is doing real things to real brains, and the fact that the people breathing the smoke or drinking the wine experience those chemical effects through the lens of faith does not make the chemical effects disappear. It just means they get interpreted as something holier than pharmacology. Every era has its version of this particular cognitive arrangement. This substance is sacred and spiritual when we use it in our building, under our supervision, according to our rules. That substance is degenerate and dangerous when they use it in their space, under no one's supervision, according to no approved rules. The church burned psychoactive resin in an enclosed room and called it worship. The herbalist burned psychoactive plants in an enclosed room and risked being called a witch. The substance was not the issue. The institution was the issue. The permission was the issue. The authority to define which smoke was holy and which smoke was heresy was the issue. And that authority belonged to the people who controlled the buildings, not the people who understood the plants. Speaking of the church and its complicated relationship with intoxicating substances, let us stay inside these stone walls a little longer, because the same institution that burned incense in its sanctuaries and debated the morality of herbalists and worried publicly about the sins of drunkenness was simultaneously running some of the largest, most productive, and most commercially successful intoxicant manufacturing operations on the continent, the monastery brewery. It begins with a rule. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century and adopted as the foundational document of Western monasticism, includes a specific provision for the daily consumption of alcohol. Each monk was to receive a hemina of wine per day, a measure scholars have debated but generally estimate at roughly a quarter of a liter, maybe slightly more. Benedict himself was somewhat apologetic about this allowance, writing that while he believed monks ideally should not drink wine at all, he acknowledged that the monks of his time could not be persuaded of this, and so a modest daily ration was permitted. The tone is that of a practical administrator making a concession to human nature rather than an enthusiast endorsing the product. But the concession was made. It was written into the rule. And once alcohol consumption was embedded in the foundational text of monastic life, the infrastructure to produce it followed as inevitably as a river follows gravity. In regions where wine was not readily available, which meant much of northern Europe, beer and ale served as the substitute, and the monks brewed it themselves. What began as a practical necessity for internal consumption grew, over centuries, into a commercial enterprise of remarkable scale and sophistication, and the monks had advantages that no secular brewer could match. They had literacy. In a world where most brewing knowledge was passed orally from mother to daughter or master to apprentice, monks could write down their recipes, record their experiments, track their results across batches and seasons and years, and build a cumulative body of technical knowledge that improved continuously over generations. A secular brewer's expertise died with her, unless she successfully taught it to someone else before she went. A monastery's brewing knowledge was institutional. It lived in the library, not in any single pair of hands. They had continuity. Secular brewing operations were vulnerable to every disruption that affected medieval families and businesses. Inheritance disputes, plague, debt, fire, the death of a skilled practitioner with no trained successor. Monasteries endured. The community outlasted any individual member. The brewing operation could be refined over decades, over centuries, without interruption. A monastery that started brewing in the 9th century was still brewing in the 15th, and it had 600 years of accumulated refinement behind every batch. They had capital, church wealth, accumulated through donations, land grants, and the careful management of agricultural estates, provided the resources to build dedicated brewery buildings, invest in better equipment, purchase quality ingredients in bulk, and absorb the occasional failed batch without financial catastrophe. A secular alewife whose batch spoiled lost everything she had invested in it. A monastery whose batch spoiled opened another cask and noted what went wrong for next time. And they had tax advantages that were, from a competitive standpoint, devastating. Monastic brewing operations were frequently exempt from the local taxes, tolls, and guild fees that secular brewers paid. The gruet tax, the assize regulations, the tasting fees, the court fines that formed the background cost of every alewife's operation, these often did not apply to monastic production, or applied at reduced rates, or were conveniently overlooked by local authorities, who had complicated relationships with the religious institutions in their jurisdiction. The monastery could sell its beer at competitive prices, with significantly lower overhead than any secular competitor, and the margin between cost and price went directly back into the institution. The scale of monastic brewing was not modest. Major abbeys produced thousands of gallons per year. Some maintained multiple brew houses, producing different strengths of beer for different purposes. The weakest, small beer, was for daily consumption by the monks themselves, and for distribution to the poor and to travelers who stopped at the monastery for hospitality. Stronger beer was produced for feast days, for the abbot's table, and for commercial sale. The strongest, sometimes called audit ale or March beer, was brewed with extra malt and allowed to mature longer, and it commanded premium prices at market. Monastic vineyards were even more commercially significant. The great wine regions of Burgundy and the Rhine owe their reputation in large part to monks who selected the vineyard sites, developed the cultivation techniques, and refined the winemaking processes that later secular producers inherited. The Cistercians, in particular, approached viticulture with a systematic rigor that amounted to agricultural science, identifying which slopes caught the best sun, which soils drained properly, which grape varieties performed best in which microclimates. The terroir concept that modern wine culture treats with almost religious reverence was, in a very literal sense, developed by religious communities applying religious patience to agricultural observation. The economics formed a loop that was elegant in its efficiency and troubling in its implications. The monastery collected tithes from the surrounding population. Tithes were paid in kind, which often meant grain. The monastery used that grain to brew beer. The monastery sold the beer commercially, often to the same population that had provided the grain as a tithe. The farmer who grew the barley paid it to the church as a spiritual obligation and then bought it back, transformed into beer as a commercial transaction. He was paying for his own grain twice, once as a duty, once as a customer, and the monastery kept the profit from both transactions, reinvesting it in land, in buildings, in equipment, and in the expansion of the operation that would collect next year's tithe and brew next year's beer. An institution that preached moderation and temperance while simultaneously operating the largest, most efficient, and most profitable brewing enterprises on the continent is not a medieval peculiarity. It is a template. It is the original version of a pattern that has repeated itself in every century since. The organization that profits from the thing it publicly disapproves of, the institution whose moral authority and commercial interests point in opposite directions, and whose commercial interests win the argument every single time, without anyone ever having to acknowledge that the argument happened. The monks brewed, the monks profited, the monks preached restraint, and the barrels kept rolling out the gate. The evening trade is slowing now. The market square where the morning was loud with commerce is quieting, as the last carts are loaded and the last deals are struck. But there is one more growing thing to follow tonight, before we turn to the spice routes and the darker corners of the law, and it is a plant that medieval Europe could not have functioned without, and that modern culture cannot stop arguing about. Hemp, Cannabis sativa, the plant that built the Navy and confused the historians. The first thing to understand about hemp in the medieval world is the sheer, almost staggering scale of its cultivation. Hemp fiber was not optional, it was essential. It was the primary material for rope production, and rope was the connective tissue that held medieval infrastructure together. It rigged the ships that carried trade goods across the seas. It drew the water from the village wells. It hitched the oxen to the plow. It bound cargo on carts and on the backs of pack horses. It strung the bows, lashed the scaffolding, and hauled the stones that built the churches. Naval powers consumed hemp rope in quantities that modern imaginations struggle to grasp, and the demand only accelerated as maritime trade and naval warfare expanded through the later medieval period and into the age of exploration. A single large warship required miles of rope. Rope wore out, stretched, rotted, and snapped under stress, and had to be replaced constantly. The appetite was permanent and enormous. Hemp fiber also made canvas, and the word itself tells the story. Canvas derives directly from cannabis. Canvas meant sails, and sails meant that the ability of any maritime nation to project commercial or military power across open water depended directly, physically, on its access to hemp. England, France, Spain, and the Italian city-states all maintained hemp cultivation as a matter of strategic national priority, and some went considerably further than encouragement. Henry VIII famously ordered every farmer with 60 acres or more to dedicate a quarter acre to hemp or flax cultivation on pain of a fine. The crown did not want hemp. It needed hemp. The Navy needed rope. The merchant fleet needed sails. And the supply had to be domestic and reliable, because depending on foreign hemp in wartime was a vulnerability no strategist could tolerate. But hemp is not only fiber. The seeds were pressed for oil used in cooking, in lamps, and as a base for paints and varnishes, and medicinal preparations. The seeds themselves were eaten whole, ground into meal for baking, or fed to livestock as a nutritious supplement. The plant was a crop of remarkable versatility, useful from root to tip, and its cultivation was so deeply woven into the agricultural fabric of medieval Europe that finding a region without it would have been more surprising than finding one with it. And the flowering tops of the female plant, when cultivated under certain conditions and harvested at the right stage of maturity, contain tetrahydrocannabinol, the compound that makes cannabis psychoactive. The compound that is the reason you are thinking about this plant right now, instead of thinking about flax, which is in many respects a comparable fiber crop, but which has never once been the subject of a late-night video. The question of whether medieval Europeans consumed cannabis for its psychoactive effects is one of those historical puzzles that refuses to resolve neatly into a yes or a no. The evidence exists, but it exists in fragments, in sidelong references, in ambiguities that scholars have been interpreting in different directions for decades. Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century abbess, polymath, composer, mystic, and one of the most remarkable intellects in the entire medieval period, mentions hemp in her medical writings, and notes that it can be useful for certain ailments, but may be harmful to those with a weak constitution or a delicate stomach. Her tone is practical, clinical, neither enthusiastic nor alarmed. She is describing a plant she knows, in the same voice she uses to describe dozens of other plants in her herbal. Other medieval herbals mention cannabis, with similar brisk detachment, noting its properties without commentary on recreational use. Archaeological evidence adds texture, but not clarity. Cannabis seeds have been found at sites across medieval Europe in contexts that suggest more than purely agricultural processing. Seeds recovered alongside pipe fragments, seeds found in domestic hearth contexts, rather than in areas associated with fiber retting or rope making, seeds in burial contexts that imply ritual or personal significance. The evidence is suggestive. It is not conclusive. It is the kind of evidence that supports a strong suspicion without providing a definitive answer. Nobody left a medieval diary entry reading, "Had a wonderful evening with the hemp flowers, and slept remarkably well," which would have settled the argument permanently and saved historians decades of careful speculation. The Islamic world, by contrast, left documentation so extensive it amounts to an entire literary genre. Arabic literary and medical texts discuss hashish with a frankness, detail, and cultural richness that European sources never come close to approaching. Poets wrote about its effects with the same lyrical attention they gave to wine. Physicians cataloged its properties, its dosages, and its dangers with professional thoroughness. Legal scholars debated its status under Islamic law with sophisticated and sometimes contradictory arguments, since the Quran clearly prohibits khamr, intoxicating drink, but does not specifically mention cannabis by name, which created a legal ambiguity that different scholars in different regions resolved in different directions depending on their theological school and their personal inclination. The 1001 Nights, that vast compendium of stories that served as a mirror of Islamic social life across centuries, contains casual references to hashish consumption that are humorous, affectionate, and clearly rooted in common, recognizable social experience. This was not a hidden practice. It was a known, debated, sometimes celebrated, sometimes condemned, always acknowledged feature of daily life in the medieval Islamic world. And then there is the myth, the one that has attached itself to cannabis more persistently and more colorfully than any other legend in the entire history of the plant. The assassins. The word itself, assassin, is popularly claimed to derive from hashishin, meaning users of hashish, and the story connects it to Hassan-e-Sabith and his followers in the mountain fortress of Alamut in 11th and 12th century Persia. The legend, propagated with great enthusiasm by Marco Polo and by various crusader chroniclers who had every political reason to demonize the sect, claims that Hassan drugged his young followers with hashish, led them into a secret garden designed to perfectly resemble the paradise promised in Scripture, complete with flowing streams and beautiful companions, and then told them that death in his service would return them to that garden forever. The story is spectacular. It has everything: drugs, deception, fanaticism, secret gardens, and murder as a religious sacrament. It is also almost certainly propaganda. The historical Ismaili community based at Alamut was a genuine political and military force in the medieval Middle East, with real theological commitments, a sophisticated organizational structure, and a network of fortresses that held out against vastly larger armies for nearly 2 centuries. Reducing this complex religious and political movement to a hashish-fueled assassination cult was enormously useful for the Sunni caliphs, the Crusader states, and the Mongol invaders, who all had reasons to delegitimize the Ismailis, and it has remained useful for writers and filmmakers who want a sensational story ever since. The historical evidence for systematic hashish use as a recruitment or motivation tool at Alamut is thin to the point of transparent. The word hashishin may not even have originally referred to hashish consumption at all. Some scholars believe it was simply a derogatory term, meaning rabble or troublemakers, applied by enemies who wanted to diminish the sect's religious credibility. The drug story stuck, because drug stories always stick. They are too good, too lurid, too satisfying to let go, regardless of what the evidence actually supports. The status flip embedded in the cannabis story is one of the most striking reversals you will encounter tonight. In the medieval Islamic world, hashish was the intoxicant of the lower classes. It was cheap, it was accessible, it was associated with laborers, beggars, wandering holy men, and people who could not afford wine or did not move in social circles where wine was served. The social stigma was real, and it ran firmly, downward. Respectable people did not use hashish. They might write poetry about it, in the same way a modern novelist might write about dive bars without being seen in one. But open consumption was a class marker and not a flattering one. In the modern Western world, cannabis has been comprehensively, expensively rebranded. It is a wellness product. It comes in artisanal packaging with minimalist design. It is sold in shops with clean lines and warm lighting and knowledgeable staff who use words like terpene profile and entourage effect without a trace of irony. A gram of premium cannabis flower in a modern dispensary can cost more per weight than many of the spices that medieval merchants shipped across oceans at considerable risk. The same plant, the same compound, the same fundamental effect on the same human brain. Completely inverted social status, separated by 8 centuries and a few thousand miles of cultural drift. The substance did not change. The audience changed. The marketing changed. The price changed. The plant itself remains serenely, botanically indifferent to all of it. But cannabis, for all the cultural noise that surrounds it across every century it has touched, was a relatively gentle substance compared to what was growing in the quieter, more shadowed corners of the medieval garden. Because Europe had access to a family of plants that were not gentle at all. Plants that did not nudge your consciousness gently sideways, but grabbed it by the collar and threw it bodily off a cliff into territory that the human mind was not designed to visit. Plants that skilled healers used with extreme caution and deep respect, that poisoners used with cold precision, and that the church eventually decided were evidence of direct, personal communion with the devil. The Solanaceae, the nightshade family, henbane, mandrake, belladonna, and thornapple. You have already met henbane and mandrake on the apothecary's shelf, measured and compounded by a professional with years of training and a healthy fear of getting the dosage wrong. But the full story of these plants extends far beyond the shop, out into the garden and the hedgerow and the waste ground, and into territory that the medieval world found genuinely, viscerally frightening. The active compounds in all 4 plants are tropane alkaloids, primarily atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. These are not subtle substances. They do not produce the warm, fuzzy, gentle shift of cannabis or the dreamy euphoria of opium. In medicinal doses, they suppress pain, reduce secretions, relax smooth muscle, slow the heart, and produce drowsiness. In higher doses, in doses just beyond the medicinal range, they produce vivid and often terrifying hallucinations, a physical sensation of flying or floating that feels absolutely real to the person experiencing it, extreme confusion and disorientation, a complete inability to distinguish hallucination from reality, tachycardia that feels like the heart is trying to escape the chest, dry mouth so severe the tongue swells and sticks to the palate, blurred vision, urinary retention, and afterward, frequently, total amnesia for the entire experience. The person who took too much henbane might spend hours in a state of waking delirium, seeing people who were not there, holding conversations with empty air, believing, with perfect conviction, that they were flying above the rooftops, and then wake the next morning with no memory of any of it, and a body that felt like it had been beaten. The experience of tropane alkaloid intoxication, as described in both historical accounts and modern clinical case reports from accidental poisonings, sounds less like a recreational high and more like a medical emergency that happens to include visions. There is a reason these plants were treated with fear and respect by everyone who understood them, and there is a reason the apothecary kept them behind his counter rather than in the front of the shop. Belladonna, Atropa belladonna, the deadly nightshade, earned its beautiful name through a specific and remarkably persistent cosmetic application. Women in Renaissance Italy, and almost certainly earlier, used drops of diluted belladonna extract in their eyes to dilate their pupils. Large, dark, dilated pupils were considered a mark of beauty, a sign of youth and desire and emotional openness, and the effect of belladonna was reliable, dramatic, and visible from across a room. The word belladonna itself means beautiful woman, and it was given to the plant not by physicians cataloging its dangers, but by the women who used it to make themselves more attractive, by a standard they had not invented, but had fully internalized. The fact that the same substance in slightly higher concentrations caused blurred vision, light sensitivity, hallucination, delirium, and death was apparently an acceptable entry on the risk side of the ledger. Belladonna drops for cosmetic pupil dilation were the medieval equivalent of injecting botulinum toxin into your face to smooth wrinkles. A genuinely toxic substance, voluntarily applied to the body in pursuit of an aesthetic standard, with full knowledge that the margin between the desired effect and a seriously adverse outcome was not particularly wide. The only meaningful difference between then and now is the regulatory paperwork and the lighting in the waiting room. And then there is the flying ointment, the most persistent, most debated, and most tantalizingly unresolvable claim in the entire history of European witchcraft. The theory, supported by some historians and ethnobotanists and pharmacologists, and disputed with equal vigor by others, holds that certain women in the medieval and early modern period prepared ointments from solanaceous plants, typically henbane, belladonna, mandrake, and sometimes thornapple, combined with a fat base such as lard or goose grease, and applied these ointments to mucous membranes, often using a staff or broom handle as the applicator. The tropane alkaloids would absorb through the skin or the mucous membranes and produce the characteristic physiological effects: the sensation of flying, the vivid hallucinations, the feeling of leaving the body behind and traveling through the air to distant places. The broomstick, in this reading of the evidence, was not a magical mode of transport. It was a drug delivery mechanism, and the flight was not supernatural, it was pharmacological. The evidence for this practice is real, but limited, and deeply contested. Court records from witch trials across Europe contain confessions describing ointments and flying, but confessions extracted under torture, or the credible threat of torture, are unreliable evidence for anything except what the interrogators wanted to hear, and what the accused was willing to say to make the pain stop. Some herbals and medical texts reference ointments made from solanaceous plants for external application. The pharmacology is sound and reproducible. Tropane alkaloids can and do absorb through the skin and through mucous membranes, and the resulting physiological experience does include powerful sensations of flight, dissociation, and visionary hallucination. The chemistry works. The question is whether the practice was real, widespread, and organized, or whether it was an occasional, individual, private experiment that later authors, prosecutors, and storytellers inflated into a tradition and then into evidence of a continent-wide satanic conspiracy. The flying ointment sits exactly on the border between documented pharmacology and unverifiable legend, and that is probably where it will remain. The evidence is too strong to dismiss entirely, and too weak to confirm conclusively. It is one of those historical questions that is more honest as a question than it could ever be as an answer. What the evidence does make absolutely clear is that the line between a healer and a witch was never a line drawn by pharmacology. It was a line drawn by power. The apothecary, who compounded henbane into a plaster for a patient's toothache and sold it from his guild-regulated shop on a respectable street, was practicing medicine. The woman who grew henbane in her garden and prepared the same compound with the same ingredients, in the same proportions for her neighbors, without guild credentials, without a shop, and without institutional sanction, was, depending on the decade, the region, the local politics, and the mood of whoever decided to file a complaint, practicing either folk medicine or witchcraft. The substance was identical. The preparation was identical. The effect on the patient's body was identical. The difference was entirely in who was doing it, where they were doing it, and whether the authorities who controlled the definitions had decided that their particular form of knowledge was acceptable or threatening. The church did not condemn belladonna. It did not condemn henbane. It did not condemn mandrake. It condemned the unauthorized use of knowledge that it could not control, deployed by people it could not regulate, in spaces it could not supervise. And it condemned the women who held that knowledge most often and most visibly, because they were the people most consistently operating outside the institutional frameworks that the church and the guilds and the municipal courts had carefully constructed to manage who was allowed to know what and who was allowed to sell what to whom. The witch was not defined by her substances. She was defined by her independence, and her independence was the thing that the institutions around her found most intolerable. The evening is deepening now. The apothecary has closed his shutters and latched his door. The alewife's fire has burned down to embers that glow soft orange in the dark. The garden where the henbane grows is still and fragrant with 100 different plants whose names and natures and dangers the woman who tends it knows by heart, because her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her mother, and the knowledge runs back further than any written record can follow. But there is still smoke rising in this world, thin columns of it, pale against the darkening sky, and some of that smoke is coming from the market square, where the last of the day's trade is being locked away behind heavy lids and iron clasps, and the most expensive substances on earth are being carried home by men who sleep with one eye open and a key on a cord around their necks. Because the spice trade was not just about making food taste better. It was a delivery system, and some of what it delivered, in sufficient quantity, was capable of making an ordinary afternoon significantly more interesting than the official paperwork would ever admit. Consider nutmeg, Myristica fragrans, a small, hard, aromatic seed that traveled further than almost any other commodity in the medieval world to reach the kitchens and apothecary shops of Europe. Nutmeg is native to the Banda Islands, a tiny archipelago in the Moluccas, modern-day eastern Indonesia, so remote that for centuries European merchants had no clear idea where the spice actually came from. They knew it arrived through a chain of middlemen, stretching from Southeast Asia through the Indian Ocean trading networks, through Arab ports, through Venetian or Genoese merchants, and finally, to the spice markets of London and Paris and Bruges. At each link in the chain, a markup was applied. The farmer in the Banda Islands who harvested the nutmeg earned almost nothing. The final consumer in a European city paid a price that reflected 10,000 miles of transport, dozens of hands, multiple currencies, and the accumulated profit margins of everyone in between. A pound of nutmeg in 14th century Europe could cost the equivalent of several weeks of a laborer's wages. Expressed in a carpenter's daily pay of 5 or 6 pence, a single pound of nutmeg might represent 10, 15, even 20 days of work, depending on the year and the market conditions. You could buy it in small quantities, a few whole nuts, grated sparingly over food, or stirred into wine, or compounded by the apothecary into medicinal preparations. Nobody was using nutmeg casually. Every pinch represented money, and the money represented labor, and the labor represented time that a working person would never get back. What most people did not know then, and what many people do not know now, is that nutmeg in large doses is a hallucinogen. Myristicin, one of the active compounds in nutmeg, is metabolized by the liver into a substance chemically related to medema, and in sufficient quantity, it produces euphoria, visual disturbances, dissociation, and a dreamlike state that can last for hours. The required dose is high, far higher than any reasonable culinary use, and the side effects are deeply unpleasant: nausea, headache, dry mouth, and a lingering malaise that can persist for days. Nutmeg intoxication is not fun, but it is real, and it has been documented in cases from the medieval period through to the modern era, most frequently among people who lacked access to more conventional intoxicants and experimented with what was available. The medieval spice merchant who sold you nutmeg by the quarter ounce was probably not thinking about its hallucinogenic properties. He was thinking about profit margins and supply chains and the fact that his Venetian supplier had just raised prices again. But the apothecary who compounded nutmeg into medicinal preparations alongside other warming spices understood that the line between a therapeutic dose and something stranger was a line that existed somewhere inside the small, hard, fragrant seed, even if he could not draw it precisely on a chart. Saffron tells a similar story from a different angle. Crocus sativus, harvested as the dried stigmas of a specific crocus flower, was the most expensive spice in the medieval world by weight, and remains so today. The labor required to produce a single pound of saffron is almost absurd. Each flower produces only 3 tiny stigmas. The stigmas must be hand-harvested at exactly the right moment and carefully dried. It takes somewhere in the range of 70,000 to 80,000 flowers to produce a single pound of finished saffron. The price reflected this, and the price was staggering. Saffron was worth more than its weight in gold in some markets and some periods, and it was used not only as a flavoring and a dye, but as a medicine prescribed for melancholy, for digestive complaints, and for conditions we would today recognize as depression and anxiety. Modern research has validated some of these uses. Saffron contains compounds, including crocin and saffronol, that have demonstrated antidepressant effects in clinical studies. The medieval physician who prescribed saffron-infused wine for a patient suffering from persistent low spirits was not engaging in magical thinking. He was applying a remedy that worked, for reasons he could not explain in modern biochemical terms, but could observe in his patients' recoveries. The cost made it a remedy available primarily to the wealthy, which added another layer to the already complex economics of medieval mood management. If you were rich enough to afford saffron, you had access to an effective antidepressant. If you were not, you had prayer, ale, and whatever the hedgerow offered. Follow a single nutmeg backward, along the trade route, and the scale of the enterprise becomes vertiginous. The seed was harvested by hand on a volcanic island. It was dried, sorted, and packed into bundles. It was loaded onto a local trading vessel and carried to a regional port. It was sold to a long-distance merchant who shipped it across the Indian Ocean in a vessel that might not survive the voyage. It was offloaded at an Arabian port, taxed, warehoused, and sold again. It was carried overland by camel caravan to a Mediterranean port, taxed again, sold again. It was loaded onto a Venetian or Genoese galley and shipped to Italy, taxed again, sold again. It was packed onto mules and carried over Alpine passes to northern Europe, taxed at every border crossing. It arrived at a spice merchant's warehouse in London or Bruges, marked up one final time, and placed on a shelf where a customer could purchase a few grams for the cost of several days of skilled labor. At every stage, someone profited, the farmer least of all, the long-distance merchants, and the Venetian middlemen most of all. The customer at the end of the chain paid a price that contained the accumulated tolls and tariffs and markups of a dozen jurisdictions and twice as many middlemen, and the spice that finally arrived in a European kitchen or apothecary shop was, in some cases, carrying more than just flavor. It was carrying the potential for an altered state, wrapped up in a cooking ingredient, delivered through the most expensive supply chain on earth, and sold without a single word of warning or explanation about what it might do if you used enough of it. The medieval spice trade was the pharmaceutical supply chain wearing a culinary disguise. The same ships that brought you cinnamon for your pastry brought you nutmeg that could, in sufficient quantity, make a Tuesday afternoon considerably more complicated. The same merchant who sold you saffron for your rice was selling you an antidepressant without either of you using that word. The categories we draw today between food, medicine, and drug were lines the medieval world did not draw because the substances themselves refused to stay on one side. The market is closing now. The spice merchant is locking his chest with a key he keeps on a cord around his neck, because the contents are worth more than most of the buildings surrounding him. The last of the daylight is fading, the candles are being lit, and the world is about to get quieter and darker and more reflective as we turn from what people consumed to what happened when the consequences arrived. The law, in every civilization that tolerated intoxicants, had opinions about who was allowed to be intoxicated and under what circumstances. And in every civilization that left records, those opinions followed the same pattern, with a consistency that would be impressive if it were not so depressing. The rules applied downward. They always applied downward. In medieval England, public drunkenness was a finable offense, and the records show exactly who paid those fines. Laborers, servants, tradespeople, the alehouse regulars whose names appear in court, roll after court roll, fined a few pence each time, paying and returning, in the same grinding cycle that the alewives knew from the other side of the counter. The fines were small enough to pay and large enough to sting, which was precisely the point. They were not designed to stop the behavior. They were designed to generate revenue from the behavior, while maintaining the official position that the behavior was disapproved of. The same court that fined a laborer fourpence for being drunk on a Saturday night collected those fourpences across dozens of names and dozens of Saturdays, and the total was not trivial. The lord of the manor was not fined for drunkenness. The bishop was not fined for drunkenness. The merchant who drank imported wine at his private table was not fined for drunkenness. The law regulated public intoxication, and public meant visible, and visible meant poor. A wealthy man drinking himself into oblivion behind closed doors in his own hall was exercising a private liberty. A poor man drinking himself into the same state at the alehouse on the village green was committing an offense against public order. The substance was the same. The state of intoxication was the same. The venue determined the crime. Drinking was not the problem. Drinking where the wrong people could see you was the problem. The alewife faced her own version of this asymmetry, and it was sharper than most. The fines for selling ale that was too strong, too weak, measured short, priced wrong, or otherwise in violation of the assize, were levied almost exclusively against small, independent female brewers. The monastery brewery selling commercially, often at scale, that dwarfed any cottage operation, frequently operated under exemptions that shielded it from the same regulations. The guild breweries that emerged in the later medieval period had the institutional weight to negotiate their regulatory burden downward. The alewife had no institution behind her. She stood alone in front of the court, paid her fine, and went home to brew again, because there was no alternative livelihood that would replace the income. The cucking stool is where the story darkens. This was a punishment device, a chair mounted on a beam that could be swung out over a river or pond and plunged into the water, and it was associated specifically with women convicted of brewing offenses, of being a common scold, or of other violations that amounted to a woman being too loud, too visible, or too commercially independent for the comfort of the authorities. The cucking stool was not applied to male brewers. It was not applied to monks. It was a gendered punishment for an economic activity that happened to be dominated by women, and its existence tells you everything you need to know about whose intoxication the law was concerned with controlling and whose it was content to ignore. The Islamic world offers a parallel that is structurally identical despite the enormous differences in legal and religious framework. The Quran prohibits khamr, intoxicating drink, and Islamic jurisprudence developed extensive and sophisticated legal arguments about what this prohibition covered, how it should be enforced, and what the penalties should be. But the enforcement, as multiple historians have documented, was sharply uneven. Wine poetry flourished during the same centuries that prohibition was officially in force. Wealthy households maintained private wine cellars. Caliphs and sultans drank, sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly, and the legal consequences they faced ranged from mild to non-existent. The penalties for drinking fell, as penalties for drinking always fell on the people without the social position to make enforcement uncomfortable for the enforcers. The poor drinker in the marketplace, the servant caught with a jug, the person whose intoxication was public because their entire life was public, because they had no private space in which to be invisible. The Roman pattern was older and even more explicit. Various emperors closed or restricted taverns, and the restrictions were aimed squarely at the lower classes. Taverns were gathering places for the urban poor, and the anxiety they generated in the ruling class was not really about alcohol. It was about congregation. People gathering, talking, forming opinions, potentially organizing. The tavern was a social space as much as a drinking space, and the decision to regulate it was a decision about who was allowed to gather and where, dressed up as a decision about who was allowed to drink and how much. The through line across every civilization, every century, every legal and religious framework is the same. Regulation was not about the substance. It was about who was profiting, who was gathering, and who was stepping out of their assigned place. A regulatory system that fines small producers while granting institutional producers exemptions, that punishes public consumption while ignoring private excess, that targets women and the poor while leaving the wealthy and the connected undisturbed, is not a medieval quirk. It is a business model that survived intact through every century that followed, and operates with perfect efficiency today. The language changed, the mechanism did not. And somewhere inside this system, in every century, there were people for whom the intoxicant stopped being a choice. People for whom the drink, or the substance, crossed a line from something they enjoyed to something they needed, from a pleasure to a compulsion, from a part of their life to the thing that was quietly, steadily consuming it. The word addiction did not exist in the medieval world. The concept, as modern medicine defines it, had not been articulated, but the phenomenon was everywhere, and the people who lived alongside it described what they saw with a clarity that is sometimes startling. Seneca, writing in the 1st century, described habitual drunkenness in language that a modern clinician would recognize instantly. He wrote about the compulsion to drink, the inability to stop despite wanting to, the progressive deterioration of judgment and self-control, the way the habit consumed everything around it until it became the organizing principle of the drinker's day. He was not sympathetic. He considered it a moral failing, a deficiency of will and reason, and his tone is that of a philosopher genuinely baffled by people who cannot do the obvious thing and simply stop. But the description itself, the clinical observation underneath the moral judgment, is precise. He is describing dependency. He is describing loss of control. He is describing the progressive narrowing of a life around a single substance. He just does not have the word for it. Pliny wrote about people who could not face the morning without wine, who drank before they ate, who drank on empty stomachs to accelerate the effect, who had lost the ability to remember their own actions from the night before. He described these behaviors with a mixture of disgust and puzzlement that reads, across 2,000 years, as the same mixture of disgust and puzzlement that people express about addiction today. The emotional response has not evolved. The intellectual framework has, slowly and incompletely, but the instinctive reaction of a sober observer watching someone destroy themselves with a substance remains exactly what it was in the 1st century. How can they not just stop? The Islamic medical tradition went further than either the Greeks or the Romans, and the clinical descriptions left by physicians in the medieval Islamic world are the most detailed, pre-modern accounts of substance dependency that survive. Physicians writing in Arabic described habitual opium use with a thoroughness that reads like a modern diagnostic manual. They documented tolerance, the need for progressively larger doses to achieve the same effect. They documented withdrawal, the physical suffering that followed abrupt cessation, the sweating, the tremors, the cramping, the insomnia, the profound agitation, the desperate craving to resume use. They documented the behavioral patterns, the way a habitual user reorganized their entire life around the substance, neglecting work, neglecting relationships, neglecting health, spending money they did not have, making promises they could not keep. These were not vague moralizing observations. These were clinical case descriptions written by trained physicians who were attempting to understand and treat a condition they could see destroying their patients. Some of them prescribed gradual dose reduction, an approach that modern addiction medicine would recognize as tapering. Some prescribed substitute substances, replacing opium with milder sedatives in an attempt to wean the patient away from the stronger drug. Some were honest enough to admit that they did not know how to help, that the condition resisted their interventions, and that the patient would likely return to the substance regardless of what was prescribed. The framework they used to explain what they were observing was humoral, an excess of cold, wet temperament, a derangement of the natural balance of the body. The treatment was warming foods, exercise, prayer, and the restoration of humoral equilibrium. The framework was wrong, in the specific sense that humoral theory does not accurately describe human biochemistry. But the observations underneath the framework were right. They were looking at the same condition that modern neuroscience describes in terms of dopamine pathways and reward circuits and neural adaptation, and they were documenting it with honesty and precision, even though their explanatory model could not account for what they were seeing. The medieval European response was less clinical and more institutional. The Church classified habitual drunkenness as the sin of gluttony, a moral failing that required confession, penance, and the exercise of will. Penitential manuals, the handbooks used by priests to assign appropriate penances for confessed sins, include graduated penalties for drunkenness that suggest the priests compiling them understood perfectly well that some people confessed the same sin repeatedly because they could not stop committing it. The penances escalated. Bread and water for a day, then for 3 days, then for a week, then for 40 days. The escalation reads less like a spiritual remedy and more like an institution running out of ideas and reaching for the only tool it had, which was punishment, applied with increasing severity to a problem that punishment could not solve. Communities responded practically, even if the practical responses were limited. Families intervened, sometimes by confrontation, sometimes by physically restricting the person's access to drink, sometimes by appealing to the local priest or lord for help. In extreme cases, habitual drunkards were confined, kept in a room until the worst of the craving passed, and then released back into a world where the alehouse was still on the corner and the alewife was still displaying her steak. The community understood that some people could not govern their own consumption. It did not understand why, and its tools for addressing the problem were blunt and often cruel. But the recognition that the problem existed was real, and it was documented in records from every region of medieval Europe. The debate between addiction is a moral failing and addiction is a medical condition is not a modern argument. It was playing out in medical texts and penitential manuals and court records 1,000 years ago, with the same competing frameworks, the same lack of resolution, and the same uneasy coexistence of compassion and condemnation. The moralist said stop. The physician said, I cannot make them stop. The patient said, I cannot stop. And the gap between those three statements is a gap that 1,000 years of science and theology and law have narrowed but never closed. In the quiet of the court records, you can sometimes trace what happened next. A name that appears repeatedly in the fine rolls, fined for drunkenness once, twice, 5 times, 10 times. The fines increasing, the name beginning to appear in debt records, property sold, a trade abandoned, a family fracturing in ways that the records capture only as economic facts, a wife's separate petition, a child apprenticed out earlier than custom required, a plot of land transferred to a creditor. And then the name stops appearing at all. Not in the fine rolls, not in the tax rolls, not in the property records, not in the parish register. Just silence. A life reduced to a sequence of worsening entries in a ledger. and then an absence where entries used to be. The records do not say what happened. They do not need to. The shape of the silence says enough. The night is very late now. The candles are burning low, and the world outside has gone quiet, in the way that only a world without electric light can go quiet. Completely, absolutely, as if silence were a physical substance filling the spaces between the houses. Your head is heavy. The fire is embers, and if you are being honest, you could use something for the way you are feeling right now, because the morning is going to arrive whether you are ready for it or not, and the people of the medieval world, who understood this feeling intimately, had remedies. They had so many remedies. And the remedies ranged from the genuinely sensible, to the profoundly questionable, to the outright deranged, and sometimes a single remedy managed to be all three simultaneously. Pliny the Elder, that great cataloger of Roman knowledge and Roman nonsense in equal measure, recommended raw owl eggs as a hangover cure. He also recommended deep-fried canary. He also recommended cabbage, eaten raw before drinking to prevent drunkenness, or eaten boiled the morning after to cure it, and on this particular point, modern nutritional science reluctantly concedes that he was not entirely wrong. Cabbage contains compounds that support liver function, and the fiber helps settle a nauseated stomach. The cabbage cure is real, buried among the owl eggs and the canary, like a sensible person trapped at a party that went too far. The Assyrians contributed ground swallow's beak mixed with myrrh, which has the energy of a cure invented by someone who had run out of conventional ideas and was now operating on pure creative desperation. Medieval English remedies were more pragmatic, reflecting a culture that had extensive experience with the morning after and had developed its responses accordingly. Raw almonds eaten before drinking were believed to line the stomach and slow the absorption of alcohol, which is not precisely how digestion works, but is not completely disconnected from the principle that eating fat and protein before drinking slows gastric emptying. Betony tea was recommended for headaches the next morning. Bitter herbs, particularly wormwood, were steeped in water and drunk to settle the stomach, and the bitterness itself was believed to be therapeutic, which is at least partially true in the sense that bitter compounds stimulate digestive secretions and can ease nausea. The hair of the dog, drinking more of whatever caused the problem, was not a joke or a folk saying. It was documented as a genuine recommended practice in multiple medieval texts. The logic, expressed in humoral terms, was that the body had become accustomed to the heat and moisture of the alcohol, and that abruptly withdrawing it caused the cold, dry shock of the hangover. The remedy was to restore the humoral balance by reintroducing a moderate amount of the same substance. The humoral reasoning is wrong. The practical observation that a small amount of alcohol temporarily alleviates withdrawal symptoms is not wrong at all. It is the same observation that modern medicine makes about alcohol withdrawal, albeit with the critical caveat that it does not solve the problem but merely delays it. The most common medieval English recovery meal was a combination of eggs, bread, and a cup of small ale, consumed in the morning after a heavy night. The eggs provided protein and fat. The bread provided starch to absorb the remaining alcohol and settle the stomach. The ale provided gentle hydration, a small amount of calories, and just enough residual alcohol to take the sharpest edge off the misery, without starting the cycle again in earnest. It is a full English breakfast. The modern world did not invent the recovery meal. It inherited it, added beans and a grilled tomato, and charged £9 for it at a cafe that opens at 11. Honey was another common remedy, dissolved in warm water or spread on bread and eaten slowly. Medieval physicians did not know about fructose metabolism, but they knew that honey helped, and modern research confirms that fructose aids the metabolism of alcohol in the liver. Broth made from bone and vegetables was recommended for the same practical reasons that it is recommended today. Warm, salty, easy to keep down, and effective at replacing the fluids and minerals that a night of drinking strips from the body. The people who developed these remedies were working from observation, not from theory, and observation repeated across centuries by millions of people who needed to feel better by mid-morning, is a remarkably effective teacher. The fire has gone out now. There is no heat left in the room except the warmth of your own body under the blanket, and the blanket is coarse wool, scratchy and heavy, and surprisingly comforting in the dark. The sounds of the house are settling. A timber creaking as the cold contracts it. A mouse in the wall, moving with the quiet confidence of an animal that owns the night. Somewhere outside, a dog barks once and then falls silent, as if it realized there was nothing worth barking at. And you are lying here, in the dark, in a world that understood intoxication not as a mystery or a scandal, but as a permanent feature of being alive. A world that brewed and distilled and cultivated and prescribed and consumed and regulated and punished and profited from the human desire to feel, for a few hours, something different from ordinary life. A world that was neither more innocent nor more depraved than your own, but simply more honest about certain things that your own world prefers to dress up in medical language or legal language or marketing language, rather than say plainly. They wanted what you want, every one of them. The alewife brewing in her kitchen, the monk measuring hops in the cold stone brewery, the apothecary grinding henbane in his marble mortar, the farmer tending her poppies, the merchant locking his spice chest, the laborer at the alehouse paying his penny for a jug of something that made the evening bearable after a day that had taken everything he had, the priestess breathing sacred smoke in the dark, the physician measuring a dose of theriac with steady hands, and the knowledge that the margin between medicine and poison was a space he walked every single day. They reached for the same thing you reach for: relief from pain, escape from boredom, curiosity about what lay on the other side of an ordinary Tuesday, the desire to celebrate something worth celebrating, the need to grieve something too heavy to carry sober, the wish, simple and universal and older than language, to soften the edges of the world, just enough to make it through another night. The desire to alter consciousness is not a flaw in the human design. It is a feature. It appears in every society, every era, every culture that archaeology and history have ever uncovered, without a single exception. There is no civilization that did not find its way to some substance that changed how its people felt, and there is no civilization that did not build elaborate systems of production and trade and ritual and regulation around that substance once it was found. The impulse is as old as fire, as old as language, as old as the moment the first human being discovered that a specific plant or a specific fermentation or a specific smoke could make the inside of their head feel different from the way it usually felt, and decided, for reasons that needed no explanation then and need no explanation now, to do it again. The people in tonight's story were not primitive versions of you, fumbling through a pharmacological landscape they did not understand. They were you, the same brains, the same restless neurochemistry, the same bottomless capacity for ingenuity in the pursuit of feeling slightly better, slightly warmer, slightly more at ease inside their own skin. They understood their substances with a sophistication that would surprise you. They respected the dangers more than the myths suggest. They built economies around intoxication that were as complex and as ruthlessly efficient as anything the modern world has constructed. And they paid the same prices, in health and in heartbreak and in lives quietly consumed by the thing that was supposed to make life easier. Spare a soft thought for them tonight, the real ones. Not the cartoon peasants, or the sanitized monks, or the dramatic witches of the stories you were told as a child, but the actual, breathing, ordinary people who lived inside this world and navigated it with the same mixture of wisdom and foolishness and stubborn, hopeful, deeply human need that you carry with you every single day. The alewife is asleep now. The apothecary's mortar is still. The temple smoke has faded to nothing, and the stones are cooling in the dark. The hedgerow where the henbane grows is silver with dew. Somewhere, a poppy field stands quiet under the stars, the pods closed, the sap undisturbed, the ancient joy plant resting until the morning comes and someone reaches for it again, as someone always has, as someone always will. Let the old smoke fade. Let the fire stay out. Let the long history of reaching for something more settle itself softly into the dark, the way all histories do when the night is late enough and the eyes are heavy enough and there is nothing left to do but rest. Sleep well, breathe slow, and let the centuries blur gently into silence.